Shall we get started?
Yes.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. Just a second. Let me see. Everything is good. Okay, everything is good. All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Self-Improvement Friday, and my friend John is here. So, John, take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone who is returning, and welcome for anybody who might be new. We talk about a self-improvement topic every day. I usually try to pick a context material to back up a point. It's not really necessarily a review of the context material or the show or the book we're reading, but more so an exemplification of the attribute we're talking about. And this week, we are talking about the difference between internal versus external validation and praise. And we are using an episode of Black Mirror. It's a series on Netflix, specifically the episode titled Nosedive. And if you haven't seen it, totally fine. I'm going to summarize any relevant and necessary points, and then we'll dive into the whole validation aspect. So, Black Mirror's episode of Nosedive, I would say this is a futuristic dystopian tale where everybody is superficially ranked on their, you can say, I don't know, affirmation or validation. So if I were to look at you, if you were to look at me in public, I would have this number by my head, and that is essentially like a popularity rating, how people rate you based off of your interactions. Now, there's already a big red flag because that's not rating off of competence. It's not rating off of true character. It's rating off of what I choose to portray to the world, what I let the world see about me. So it's going to really incentivize contrived and meretricious behavior. You can just become, people pleasing and to higher your rank, and then other people will, essentially be positively rewarded for giving you a good rating. And the story follows this character named Lacey, and Lacey has a rating of, I believe it's 4.2, and 5 is the maximal rating. She's trying to get to a rating of 4.5 so she can qualify for this particular apartment complex or something like that. So naturally, it follows she tries to be a people pleaser. She tries to be on everybody's good side, and it's clearly there's clear discrepancies between her actual identity and this contrived appearance that she puts forth into the world. Eventually, she tries to become more and more desperate to really get people on her good side, to raise her rating in return in a very self-promoting, selfish way. And people start to notice these little discrepancies in her behavior. Particularly, I would say she is somebody with a rather short temper, and she tries to exhibit patience in one particular aspect where she is boarding a flight or something. I don't know, the details don't matter, but her flight gets canceled, and the person behind the counter says, "Oh, your flight's canceled. You're not gonna be able to make this." And she kind of has a little episode. She has a little incident, and she kind of blows up and attacks the person behind the kiosk. Now, mind you, everybody has the potential to rate whoever. There's no really necessarily weight. Like I said, it's kind of a popularity thing. So all the people behind her in line at the airport and the person behind the kiosk rate her negatively. So this drops her points. She tries to keep her cool, tries to keep her composure, but this really negatively affects her. And eventually, it kind of just blows up in her face. She ends up going to a wedding from an old friend, trying to speak at the wedding from making up this contrived artificial story about how much this girl getting married means to her as a friend, even though they don't really talk. Lacey's only intention is to get on everybody's good side at the wedding because all of these people are very affluent, influential people. They all have I think it's 4s and above or something like that. So all of those hundreds of 4s rating her at once, that would statistically increase her rating to a 4.5. So that's her only intention, her only motive. It's very exploitative. And like I said, it's very, very contrived. And it's especially dangerous for her because it's so her contrived image is so far away from her actual personality that it just blows up in her face and falls apart. And then by the end of the episode, she has a 1.2 rating, which is disastrous, right? But she learns to really be herself and let that mask go and just express herself authentically and try to rely on her own internal validation. So this leaves us to the theme that we're going to extract from the episode as internal versus external, you could say, opinions or weight, because we know validation, but I'm going to also take a look at criticism. We inherently know to, I would say, subordinate and relegate the importance of criticism in terms of formulating our self-image and identity. We implicitly know this. We always say there's a lot of justifications for not listening to criticism. It could be projection on the other person's behalf. They could be exhibiting jealousy. They could be engaging in a phenomenon called psychological displacement. They could be simply incorrect with the facts. They could have simply just had a bad day, and we are the only viable option for them to take out their anger on, right? That happens all the time. So we, like I said, implicitly know not to take all criticism as fact, and it's not going to always affect us. Sometimes it does, maybe, if there's enough people saying it, or if we're particularly sensitive to stuff like that, maybe. But we're not going to dive into that topic today. I think conversely, what's not discussed enough is too much reliance on external praise in formulating our own self-image and identity. Now, the dangers of that can be identical to the dangers of listening to criticism. It could be projection. You could start to overestimate your strengths and characteristics. It could lead to a distorted self-image of what you truly are. People could only be focusing on the highlights because they don't want to be mean to you or confrontational or assertive to your face. So this might be, a warped version of what you are truly like in the world if nobody's there to give you blunt feedback. If you're only listening to people who praise you or validate you based off of your emotional comfort or whatever the prime motivating reason would be, again, I think that is also arguably as detrimental as letting criticism impact our own self-image and identity. Now, I think there is a particular line that we're going to, it's kind of open for discussion. We're going to dive into the breakout rooms a little bit later, but a particular line on how we are to draw a line, because obviously I would say it's partially, arguably, I haven't really consolidated my ideas on this, partially a biological need, that being like praise and affirmation. We've talked about this in the past in this meetup group. There's a lot of evolutionarily advantageous traits that we had to, assimilate into our characteristics in order to be apt to survival. So I think praise would be one of those, like adherence to a group, receiving support or validation from a group, from your tribe, you could say. That was an advantageous trait to have in the past. And I don't think we fully outgrew that. So I do think it's partially biological. I don't know that anybody could go throughout their entire lives with no affirmation whatsoever. I'm not entirely sure on that, but that's a subject for discussion, like I said, in the breakout room. Now, I do think there is definitively a line, okay? And to explore what this line could look like in terms of passing the threshold and too much reliance on external validation, I'm going to pull a line from a book called The Fountainhead. And this book, you don't need any particular summary. This is a standalone section as it is a quote. But I think this is a really good example of somebody going too far to not being able to validate themselves. So, it is so easy to run to others. It is so hard to stand on one's own record. You can fake virtue for an audience, similar to what the main character was doing in the episode. You can't fake it in your own eyes. Your ego is the strictest judge. People run from their ego. They spend their lives running. It's easier to donate a few thousand to charity and think yourself noble than to base self-respect on personal standards of personal achievement. It's simple to seek substitutes for competence, such easy substitutes: love, charm, kindness, charity. But there is no substitute for competence. So this is exploring the idea that all of those things can be very easy to attain. Just as exemplified in the dystopian episode of The Society. You can contrive an appearance. You can make yourself look benevolent. You can make yourself appear noble, appear good charactered and good natured to the world, especially on the internet, because you have time to, fabricate an appearance. You have time to think of what you're going to portray, what you're going to type. You're not as responsive, or you're not as reactive. You're a little bit more responsive. You have time to design that little caricature of yourself and what you choose to display to the world. So I think that would be the danger of placing too much emphasis on that. And even though you might receive validation, even though you might receive praise for those attributes, for those characteristics, that is very hollow. All of us implicitly know that. It's not really that holistic. It's not that, deep of satisfaction when you get validated for something that is not who you truly are. So there's a secondary aspect to this whole section here, also in Fountainhead. The author says, every form of happiness is private. Our greatest moments are personal, self-motivated, not to be touched. The things which are sacred or precious to us are the things we withdraw from promiscuous sharing. But now we are taught to throw everything within us into public light and common pawing, to seek joy in meeting holes. I think it's very ironic that this book was ahead of its time, written in, I think, 40s or 50s or something like that. And this is extremely prevalent today in the age of social media. Like we're taught to put everything out there, not only for us, but for the contrived image that we would want to attain. I have a personal, I guess, anecdote of this with the power of social media. I've been sucked into this, like you could say, vortex before with engaging in this behavior. This was probably a year and a half ago or something, and I was in between upgrading a phone. So my phone had broken. I broke the screen. It was unusable completely. You couldn't even turn my phone on. And that evening, I had to go to a concert. I was seeing one of my favorite bands perform live. And I noticed that when I got there, one of the things that I wanted to habitually do, for some weird reason, I wanted to implicitly share that I was at this concert. Again, the video was not for me, because why would I need a video? I'm physically looking at the band, the audience play, right? Why would I need the video? Why would I need this screen as an intermediary device between me and the experience? I don't, right? But I felt that unconscious urge, like I want to capture this. And I assumed that was for sake of wanting to contrive a appearance or wanting to appear, hey, look at me, I'm eclectic, I'm into this music, I'm into that, I'm traveling, whatever the intention might have been. But I did realize that like subconscious urge to want to share it with other people. Not for my own benefit. That would be largely in place of being sucked into this vortex of, you can say, a second hander. So I do think social media is greatly an instrument that really perpetuates this ideology of placing too much praise on external validation. Now, switching gears, I do think that, we can realize indicators when we are trying to place too much emphasis on that. And there's a passage from one of my favorite books, in Beyond Good and Evil, and Nietzsche is talking about characteristics and qualities of the noble man. You could say like the higher man. And one of these is, he says, the noble man recognizes himself as a determiner of values. He does not need to be approved of. That's a very important line. He does not need external validation. So once you establish your own values, once you establish what's important to you, once you establish, okay, this is what makes me satisfied, this is what is constructive, I've looked at the ramifications of my beliefs, everything is exactly where I want it to be, I can validate myself in that regard, because we know that, as going back to the sentence, it's easier to donate to charity and think yourself noble than to base self-respect on personal standards of personal achievement. So to get that internal validation, you have to work. That is the necessary predecessor to this. You have to achieve something. You have to be proud of something. So I think that validation would be predicated on pride, you can say. And pride is not an easy thing to attain, right? It's justified self-respect, you can say, the definition of pride in some way. And then contrived self-respect would be validation from other people. And again, you can get that in a heartbeat, just going outside or posting something on the internet or putting on a mask and acting a certain way in the world. So another thing to realize that, I was doing a little bit of exploration on this topic, and I was looking through all my notes and stuff like that. And I ended up finding an idea from an author. I don't think I sourced that particular idea. But it was talking about this, don't care what other people think. A lot of people just say that. But I think there's a profound reason why we shouldn't do that. A lot of us tend to overemphasize the importance of other people's opinions who are literally strangers to us, right? We try to uphold these personal standards in public, at a restaurant. We have these little norms that we would blindly adhere to because we don't want to stand out from the crowd, because we don't want to be criticized, because we want to uphold that, merit from another person. And this makes me think of two ideas. First of all, personal merit cannot be derived from an external source. That is Epictetus in The Art of Living. The second idea is, again, from this author that I was trying to find in my notes. And he's saying a lot of us go throughout our lives trying to bend over backwards and please people who, if you really give a good thought at it, would not show up to your funeral if you died tomorrow. So they're not necessarily that influential people in our lives. They're not necessarily that much of a impact to us. They don't really have a profound connection with us, but we should ask ourselves why we still maintain and adhere to their validation when regardless, they're not even paying attention to us in the first place. So I think it's a very interesting thought. It was it's very blunt. It's a very morbid idea to think about, but I mean, I feel like it's generally true. So moving on to the third idea, the third part of this discussion, what we can practically learn from, what we can apply to our lives to recognize the importance of internal validation. The first is going off of that idea, we tend to bend over backwards The practical realization we can all implement and coalesce is realize the transitory nature of the majority of our relationships. So yes, you can say praise from your loved ones, praise from your significant other, those might be a lot more valid than external praise, like on a haphazard instance, because they inherently know you. So that praise can actually be constructive, and it's going to be more objective. It's going to be more blunt, and it's also going to, have you be ready to implement that more and actualize it on it. It's not going to be hollow. It's not going to be superficial, because of course, the less someone knows about you, the more they're going to tend to praise your superficial appearance, right? Because they don't know any inherent character traits. They don't know any discrepancies. They don't know any specific, idiosyncrasies about you. So therefore, any praise is going to be hollow in the first place. So the first idea is realize the transitory nature of our relationships, and then going off of that, don't overestimate, your own role in other people's lives. We tend to, like I said, going out in public, we tend to uphold these little social masks and things off of polite manners. I'm not saying be rude, of course. I'm not saying just do whatever you want, but within reason. You shouldn't place too much emphasis on random people that are literally strangers that don't really have a lot of effect on us anyway. And to close, I think some ideas that we can act on to really raise our own propensity to internally validate ourselves is to have more self-respect for ourselves. And firstly, there's a few ways to do this. The first is actually from a chapter in Peterson's book, 12 Rules, where he's saying, like, take care of yourself like you're someone you're responsible for helping. We tend to look at ourselves in a very detrimental light. We tend to get negatively affected by society. We tend to get subversively indoctrinated by advertisements telling us that we're not enough, we're not smart enough, we're not competent enough. We need to buy this product, consume this service to become more whole, more competent, more powerful, more beautiful, whatever it happens to be. A lot of us let that, subversively affect us. And this in turn leads to the promulgation of a negative self-image, I would say. So to turn that around is look at the positive traits within us. And again, going back to the fountainhead, this has to be derived from a sense of personal accomplishment, so personal achievement. So going off of that, practically speaking, what I've done in my life to greatly increase, I would say, my pride in myself or self-respect in a way, is to keep a journal, a specific journal only dedicated to, you could say my wins or my accomplishments or things that I surmounted or challenges that I've overcome, or, something that I learned in the midst of an obstacle. And I extracted value from that. And obviously that's very idiosyncratic. And if I ever am feeling, down, feeling doubtful of my abilities or competence, I can always just glance back and you could say, remind myself what I've overcome, remind myself how far I've come from this particular journey. And that will, lead to more justified, I would say, pride, which is a justified self-respect from analyzation of our wins. And finally, in closing, before I give it to Shrikant, again, I think the very profound idea is from Epictetus. Personal merit cannot be derived from an external source. And then there's another idea in Walden from Thoreau, where he says, public opinion is a weak tyrant compared to our own private opinion. So with that said, I will hand it on to Shrikant to moderate Q&A.
Excellent. So folks, we have 4 rules as usual. Type exclamation mark to ask questions. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Jonathan, you're first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. Thanks, John, for organizing today again. I've got a question for you about fiction. So as it relates to this topic, are there any characters from a book you've read, like a fiction book, that you hold in mind as a way to navigate away from what you don't want to become, or characters that you hold in mind to move towards something you do want to become, as it relates to this topic of, like, not caring, as you put it, not caring what other people think?
I don't know about fiction. I do know, I've extracted great value. I close with that quote from Thoreau in Walden. He notes a lot of, like, how we tend to rely on external validation in terms of society, how we tend to people please, how we tend to, suppress our own selves in order to be like other people or in order to be validated. But in terms of a fictional character, I'd have to do a lot of thinking and return to you on that. But if you haven't read Walden, that's a beautiful place to start. He has a lot of profound insights on, like, our nature of society, how we interact with one another. Because he's detached from society for 2 years and 2 months, he tends to really, like, consolidate, okay, what are my desires that I'm, maybe unconsciously trying to manifest in some way? What am I repressing? What have I been doing unconsciously when I was in society, when I was a member of it? That's a really good start.
Next up is going to be Jory, Jean, Barry, Aaron, Joe, and Jairo. Jory, go ahead.
Hey, so what I really liked the TV show was it was amazing, and I got different things from it. I mean, one of the questions from the adventures of the protagonist that came to me was, if we are not part of a social unit or a society or a family or tribe, who are we? I mean, perhaps we don't really have a social identity. And some people, that could be very a freeing revelation, as it perhaps was for the protagonist in the film. But I didn't. I think that was a very interesting question potentially. So when we think of Nietzsche, um, kind of, that you need to buck up and be an individual. Um, where would that individual be if they had no social currency? I mean, so that's, I didn't see that as a posed as a viable option in this film, because things were, if you weren't part of the system, you were living economically on the fringe and out of it, which she came across some people who were doing that. Um, but also, at the end of the film, she's arguing with the prisoner in the next cell, and it seemed like there was a whole lot of sexual tension that was building because she had never allowed herself to be passionate about anything. It was really interesting, and I did not feel that it was posing the question actually of how can you identify with yourself, because herself and her true desires were formed by society. So it seems she was in a dead end, but I just thought it was super interesting.
Yeah, those are really good insights. I mean, there's a lot of themes that could be analyzed from the show itself. I just chose to do this because I thought it was a very relevant and pertinent topic for our time, especially with the age of social media. And as you wisely pointed out, you know, she had validation. She was part of this tribe. She was in this little upper echelon limits of like 4.3, 4.4, looked at as like living this luxury lifestyle, but it wasn't really satisfactory for her, which is why she ended up, you know, letting her true colors out, you can say, in the end, and like learning to let go of all that, I don't know, all those expectations she might have externally had imposed on her, because she allowed herself to be part of this system, and she allowed herself to fake these conversations. I don't know if you remember this particular exercise, but I think this was most, this particular example, sorry, this was most accurately represented in the scene where she's in the back of an Uber or a taxi, and her friend calls from the wedding, and her whole vocal tonality changed, her whole cadence, and the cab driver just saw right through her and immediately like ended her, ranked her in a very, very low light because he saw that discrepancy. He's like, you're faking who you are to have this conversation, to get praise, to uphold some little caricature that you've built of yourself. So I think those are all really good insights that you've added. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is Jean, Barry, and Aaron. Jean?
Yeah, I think it's great topic because I read Fountainhead is about the architect. It's quite interesting. I saw the movie, you know, how he fight against the world. It doesn't really work in real life because if we see any successful architect, they usually have a great EQ, like Anne Pei, you know, he's great. You know, you can have to talk people through to have convince them your idea. But anyway, but I think you have to have a higher vision to be able to convince other people. You have to stick with your way and you convince other people to go your way. But I found in my experience, the two books most influential to me is Jack London's Martin Eden, which into a great movie lately by Italian director. Another one is Road Less Traveled. I observed my son, actually, I have go through this when I was in college and maybe, you know, high school. So I was able to not affect other people's opinion too much. But I've noticed my younger son, he's highly sensitive to other people's opinion. And I was like, you're not that important to other people. He won't even turn on his radio in class. He's very sensitive kid. So I think this is really born with. I wonder how can kids, they didn't learn from anyone. They already have that embedded in them. So how to change them, which is my concern.
That's, I mean, that's a very, very good question, a very important question as well. Um, I I think my short answer, I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen overnight. I went through a profound catalyzation period in terms of polarizing that too. I used to place significant emphasis on especially criticism that would especially used to bother me. Now it's just in one ear, out the other. And I would say the practical application that I included in the end are some methodologies we can use. Have an accomplishment journal, realize that, you are someone that you would like to become, or you're becoming someone you would like to be. In a poetic way, I've seen it phrased: the more you love your own decisions, the less you need others to love them. Okay, the more you love your own decisions, the less you need others to love them. So if you create an ideal, if you establish your goal, if you establish the ideal version of yourself, and you are steadily and deliberately and voluntarily working toward that, I would think that would elicit justified pride and direction. And you can say certainty in a sense too. So if we're very uncertain, if we're very hesitant on what we should do, I feel like that's when we are especially susceptible to, you could say external influence, even if it's praise or criticism, you could say. So getting that self-assurance and self-reliance, whatever methodologies we can implement to do that, but that might take a long time.
Next up is Barry, Aaron, Joe, Hyro, Lloyd, and MP. Barry, go ahead.
Yes, I see a pattern here. This sounds like the discussion we had about self-actualization and socialization and the value of each. And I noticed that the authors that you quote, now I'm just arguing another side. I'm not saying I disagree with you. I do agree with what you're saying because I think my personality is quite similar to yours. But I want to point out that my question is, how much is our attitude or belief in socialization versus actualization based on our personality type, being the young weekend, and we're going to be talking about personality, extroversion, introversion, because I think the authors you quote give away your opinion. You quote Ayn Rand, you quote Thoreau, Emerson, you quote and I think Gene down there quoted Jack London, and Nietzsche. These are all strong individualists. They're a believer in individualism over socialization. If you quoted from maybe Norman Vincent Peale or Dale Carnegie or maybe Nathaniel Hill, you might come up with a different opinion. It's all a matter of your value system, and that determines who you might quote. And so I think we need to be a little bit more objective. And I guess the question I ask is, how much is individualism versus socialization determined by our personality rather than some absolute value? Thank you.
Okay, so I first of all, I agree with that premise. You said we're extremely, you can be given away a sense by your influences. I completely kind of agree with that. And I do side in the sense of like strong emphasis on individualism. I actually did a presentation analyzing Candide's or Voltaire's Candide in terms of how it relates to individualism versus collectivism. So absolutely, I'm exposed, you could say, but in terms of, I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I don't think it has to be polarized. I don't think it has to be black or white. We've had discussions in the past. I don't remember if it was pertaining to a particular breakout room question, but we were saying like self-actualization and socialization are kind of they're at a crossroads. And you have to choose which one. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think there always is room for interpretation. There always is room for a little bit of context and nuance in terms of how we are to imbue one into one another, how we are to coalesce the best of both worlds moving forward. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I would approach the answer to your question.
Let me just add something, and let me give one recommendation of a video that we did by Karen. And she had this very interesting concept. She says it's not really individual versus others. It is between love and fear. If you're afraid, you kind of are in this position. Okay, so you are kind of afraid of actually discovering who you are, and you're actually afraid of other people. If you kind of spread your wings where you kind of love yourself, you are able to actually connect better with other people. So it's kind of, she's saying it's between love and fear. So people who are kind of overtly worried about other people's opinion of them are also worried about looking at themselves too closely. So it's kind of, they're governed mostly by fear. And people who are kind of feel comfortable expressing who they are also able to connect very deeply with other people. So I think that that's a much more fundamental axis than other, I versus other people, because we are social beings and we are individual beings at the same time. So just wanted to say that. Next up is Aaron, Joe, Hyro, Lloyd, MP, and Kevin. Aaron.
Hey, John, great episode, great choice of episode. I do want to say a few things about this. If I'm not mistaken, I saw the episode a while ago. The social points or whatever above people's head also acted as a proxy for money or some kind of currency. Like you need to have a certain number of points to buy plane tickets and so forth. So my question is that if you adapt this highly individualistic lifestyle, you also have to adapt a very monastic lifestyle as well. Like one, like this will cost you opportunities, and it did cost the protagonist opportunities in terms of wealth and fame and so forth. So I think that's okay if that's the road you want to go, but I think people need to be aware that when you do wear rugged individualism, there is like a price to be paid, and it's typically a monetary price. And the final thing I want to say is like, even with like someone like Jordan Peterson, who's definitely a rugged individual, even he took a lot of advice and criticism when he was publishing 12 Rules for Life in order to make that book a lot, appeal more to people. Like he made it a lot more simpler. He took the advice of editors and stuff, and he knew that he did compromise and bend on a few points in order to make his book a lot more marketable. So I'm wondering, like, if there's some kind of balance here. Like I do see the need for balance. It can't just be completely individualistic, because I do think a lot is lost if you go down that road.
Yeah, very good points. I agree. I do think there is a sense of there's a price to be paid in either way, right? Either direction. So in a sense, you can say pick your poison, right? So yes, a complete individualist. Yes, you would have no validation. If you say you would need no validation, you would never seek validation, you would never try to please anybody, do exactly what you wanted at any given second of the day. Okay, you would probably be hated. You would probably be exiled. You can argue, or conversely. I think the Black Mirror episode was a good example of this. Lacey, in the first like half of the episode, complete people pleaser, completely faking, completely suppressing and repressing all of her idiosyncrasies and actual desires in order to appeal to other people and uphold this little social persona that she's established. And it was a kind of reaffirmation loop to further do that. And, that it was further ingrained in her behavior. And the price of that was obviously repression, which leads to psychological disturbances, frustration. In her case, she had a very short temper. This led to, her exploding on other people, being very rude, being very superficial with people. So there's a price to be paid, I would say, in either direction. This might be like where we would fall on the spectrum on that scale. Like, I'd rather pay this price than that price. That might be temperamental. That might be idiosyncratic. But I do agree. It's not one or the other. There is a balance in both. But I think whatever way we choose to gravitate toward, there is still a price, no matter where we are in the spectrum. You can't avoid, some consequence or ramification of whatever your actions are. So, in short, I would say, yeah, you're picking your poison in whatever direction you tend to gravitate toward.
Next up is Joe, Hyro, and Lloyd. Joe?
Yeah, I'm just actually going to build a little bit on what Aaron was talking about, is essentially the cost of being a rugged individual. It's a great presentation, by the way. It seems like the cost has gone up since in the past 20, 30, 40 years, to a point where rugged individualism is not even necessarily possible. And part of an example of that would be the idea of something like a social credit score that is being used in China and things along those lines. I see this as a correlation with the idea of privacy and then there's a level of conformity that has to come along with that. So I think that this is a really important thing, because I don't think rugged individualism is as there's a higher cost to it now than there has been in the past, and I don't think it's really it's a little bit different from times of, say, when Ayn Rand or Thoreau were even going through some of their analysis of how to withdraw from society and break from the norms of society. So I just wanted to get your opinion maybe on the idea of the relationship between privacy and the ability to be a rugged individual.
I didn't even think of that when I was putting this together, but it is a really good insight to add. This was partially, I wanted to include a lot of this in the past discussion, actually, with Dorian Gray and like transparency, and I just decided to make this a topic in and of itself, because we can have plenty of discussion in the breakout groups, and I kind of took privacy for granted in sense of, like, we live in the age of information. Almost everything we do is broadcasted, of course, voluntarily, what we choose to expose to the world. But even if it's like a private thing that we post, or if we post it to somebody, that can rapidly, you can say, quote unquote, go viral. There's a lot more exposure, you can say, for behavior that is not that is incongruent with the dominant narrative of society, you could say. If I say a controversial opinion, you know what I mean? Even if it's what I authentically think, that might lead to outrage, and that one person being outraged can share it to a bunch of people, and that can negatively affect, as you were saying, my social score. So in a sense, we have, ironically, less privacy. And I kind of just took that for granted in the sense of, okay, if you have less privacy, you just act as if you were, being authentic at all times. And yes, you might have to pay a price, as Aaron was just talking about, but I think that is still worth the, I think it's rather worth the price of making that sacrifice than going too far over to conformity and not having an authentic opinion at all whatsoever. And I think to really fully wrap up, that's a good question for the breakout group. We have the third question is along the lines of, does the age of the internet, like the age of information, cause or amplify this? We can talk about privacy in that regard as well in the third question, the breakout group.
Okay, next up is going to be Jairo, Lloyd, MP, and Kevin. Jairo.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so you were talking about journaling, and I hear something like that you want to, one wants to...
Jairo, we are having difficulty hearing you. Can you just ask the question briefly? Go ahead.
Oh, wait a second. Wait a minute. Let me turn off the head.
Okay, I'm going to go to the next person. I'll come back to you, Jairo. Lloyd, go ahead.
Sure. Great presentation, John and Shrikant. If one of my goals is to get my work published, my poems and writing, and that takes someone approving of it, for a contest or for acceptance on in a magazine, how is that? How does that apply to that quote you gave, that my personal merit is not based on an external source, because just to get published, they have to approve of what I said, of what I wrote. Isn't that based on an external source, though?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, partially this makes me think of Aaron's, propositions of his points where he was talking about even Peterson had to, you could say, succumb to these marketers, succumb to, external societal pressure to, present his narrative, present his information a certain way. So there is a balance in terms of that spectrum. But going off of that particular quote in general, I think that's more so of like your self-image. You're like who you believe. If you believe to be consistent with the ideas and the philosophies that you hold, and if you propose these philosophies and if you behave in discordance with that, if you're not consistent with that, I think that would lead to disturbance. So I think that's my interpretation of Epictetus' quote: personal merit cannot be derived from something outside of you. You can get suggestions from outside of you, but ultimately it is you that's going to, I guess, determine your own relationship with yourself, how you feel toward yourself. Are you proud of the way you act? Are you proud of what you've done in your life so far? Or do you have this like guilty conscience and like gnawing sense of shame or guilt that's like eating at you because you know you made the wrong decision in the past and you're trying to hide it, you're trying to bury it because you value conformity over authentic expression, for example. That might be something that's going to, come back to bite you in the long run because of that guilty conscience. But if you're acting consistently, I think that's a sense of personal merit because you're knowing, okay, I had these principles. I didn't bend my principles. I was still able to find a publisher. I was still able to find a career, find an opportunity that allowed me to express my most authentic self. And then, you can say, yes, that's in assistance with you finding your merit, but it's not fully derived from it. Does that make sense? Cool.
Okay, Jairo, let's make one more try. Try to ask a brief question. Go ahead.
It's about journaling. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like what if the person is discovering that all the accomplishments are related to pleasing one or others, like maybe one person, like that they're in a relationship, or others, or like a family, or maybe the whole public. Like is journaling, are you trying to just give your self-value without the opinion of others? But what if the opinions of others is very important?
Good question. Thank you. So first of all, I wouldn't say I brought up, I think you're referencing the whole idea of me having an accomplishment journal, you can say. I write down all my achievements and everything I've surmounted. That's not only in like a self-promoting way. It's not only like what I've done for myself, if you will. It's more so like I set these goals, or as I was just talking about in my last answer, I have these values, I have these philosophies, and I was able to implement my ideas. I was able to execute in my actions in terms of closing the gap between me and my desired end. So if one of your values, if it's in your value hierarchy, in your structure to provide for your spouse, or to, give to your kids, or be an altruistic person, that's perfectly fine. That's perfectly reasonable. It's in a sense of only, validating yourself, or only providing yourself with accomplishments, or only serving yourself, you can say. That would definitely fit. That would definitely be congruent, because if that's an inherent value, you can say that's an accomplishment because you acted on your value. Right? You didn't have to do that. There was plenty of reasons or justifications why you didn't, or why you couldn't do that. But you chose to do that anyway. You chose to take deliberate risks. Maybe you chose to put yourself second, not at a expense, but you chose to put yourself second and sacrifice for the greater good of somebody else. I think it's an admirable and noble thing to do. And that could definitely be congruent and fit in terms of a accomplishment journal and your achievements. So again, I don't think it's only self-promoting. I don't think it's only what you've done for yourself. It's just what you've accomplished, what you set out to do. You had an idea, you had a goal, you had a longing, you had an intuition, you had an impulse, you had desire, and you executed on it. I think anything that falls within the realm of that, you should write, and that's going to fortify and boost and ossify, you can say, your self-respect, self-esteem, self-reliance, and pride in yourself.
Next up is MP, Kevin, Priya, and Jyoti. MP, go ahead.
Okay, so thank you for that great presentation, John, and also for the Nosedive episode. I actually just bought it just to watch that. I don't have a TV. And what struck me most about it, a lot of things struck me about it, but one thing more so than others is just the whole concept of social climbing. And not only approval from the masses and your orbit, your social orbit, your professional orbit, what have you, but also I think in the United States, there's this whole movement towards more of like commercialism and ownership and rights. And there are people out there who are just saying that people's humanity is being reduced to being a junk bond or a blue chip stock or something in between for our own survival. I personally see that how that trend is happening. It's unsettling to me as well. And I just also kind of made a parallel with Ayn Rand and the Fountainhead. I think that Ayn Rand had talked about statism and how she was against a man's life living for the state, and just how in some ways this whole thing about being rated by every person that you meet is a caricature, but it does speak to the fact that now all of a sudden you may be owned by the state, just in terms of the privileges that you may have at the airport or renting a car. And I would, what would you say to somebody who's really struggling to self-actualize and be himself or herself, but also to be seen as a valuable asset in society at large?
Can you consolidate the question a little bit more precisely?
Yeah. What would you say to somebody who is struggling to really be who they are, to live their life purpose, but also not to lose hope in terms of being seen as valuable in society? If that can clash in between their internal system and society at large. I hope that clarifies.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think an approach can be a more practical approach to this is relating kind of in a sense, my interpretation to Aaron's question. There's a kind of balance in terms of like, it's not all about like a rash individualism. It's not all about like a complete collectivism. It's more so like finding where you would land on the spectrum. And in that particular question, in the realm of like, you can say, society, all these things, I would say, in a very practical, almost trivial way, have this like search for areas of overlap where you can find compromises. Search for areas that you can, imagine a Venn diagram where you would have this overlap. You would have this, okay, these are congruences. This mutually meets my own values. It's going to make me feel justified. I'm not going to feel a certain type of way. I'm not going to feel fake or inauthentic if I'm living this way. But mutually, it is of service or of value to society as a whole, or it's going to produce an external result that is going to be desirable for people to consume, or something like that. So I would say, in short, because obviously there's multiple modalities we can use in either direction. I could get internal validation 1,000 different ways. I can also be of value to society, you could say 100,000 different ways. So that leaves us with a lot of room for ambiguity, a lot of room for interpretation on finding and designing that particular life trajectory that is going to make a lot of compromise as much as possible, I would say, in between those two.
All right, so we'll take last 3 questions and then do breakout rooms. So it's going to be Kevin, Priya, and Jyoti. Kevin.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you for John presentation. I think we need both of validation from internal and external. It's not an either-or question. It is a 2-layer validation that we should find overlap between. And we need self-judgment based on our own principle, and then not only self-image ourselves, also provide to others, perceive, to react to others, to us, right? To feedback to our own self. Here's the question is, I think the question we need the judgment. Let's see, validate which one is the house validation from external or is unhoused one. Do you agree with that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do see, as I brought up in the presentation early on, I don't think it's inherently entirely possible to live without any form of external praise or validation, in a sense, because like I said, I think it is partly biological in nature. We realize how important that is to children, for example, with the trivial and frivolous exercise of like giving them a gold star for doing their homework, right? That is external validation, you can say. And like they need that. They need that validation because they don't have their own self-image. They don't have their identity really established yet. So they need some sort of like boundaries, you can say, to establish, okay, this is good behavior, that's bad behavior, in a conditioning sense. So I do think we inherently need it in some way. What I'm more so proposing is a lot of people, especially in modern age, with the age of information, age of social media and all these things, tend to gravitate too much toward placing more emphasis on external validation than internal validation. In other words, they don't feel valuable unless they are told that they're valuable. I think it's a very psychologically degrading state to be in. It's very disempowering, and that means you only would exist, you only would feel pride, you only would feel fulfilled and meaningful in relationship to another person and what you can do for them to validate you, right? So I do think there's a threshold. That's what we're going to discuss in the breakout rooms in a few minutes. I do think there is a threshold on, yes, we need some sort of external validation, praise, worship, you can say. But there is a line where it's like we're placing too much on that. We should be able to take that and really not let it affect our identity as much as if we had our own validation, if we had our own internal mechanism, like we were talking about earlier with the journal, with the accomplishments, with being consistent with our philosophies and our values, and having that pride, having that adherence, having that like being aligned, being in alignment. I think that should be where we as a society, most of us in society with the age of information, can do with using more of that internal validation. So that's all I'm really proposing here. Is like there's a dichotomy here, and we should be on one side of the spectrum a little bit more.
Next up is Priya, Jyoti, and Sarika. Priya, go ahead. Priya, you need to unmute yourself. Go ahead. Okay, looks like there is a audio problem you have. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, John, I totally agree with your priorities. I think internal validation is very important in life. This is coming from a person who's older, experienced, and gone through a lot of trivials in life. If you don't have internal validation, you can't live comfortably with yourself, because people come and go. They will validate you today, then that person will go, the other person will not validate you, so you don't know where you stand. You're like a peanut monkey who does not know in what direction to go. However, with the same token, like Lloyd was saying, if you're in like a PR kind of a job, and your popularity sort of depends on how you relate to the other people. And sometimes I know it's not right, but sometimes you just have to let them validate you so that you know where you stand with different people. And there's nothing wrong in that. We all have multiple personalities. And it shouldn't be internal versus external. Internal helps you to to live with yourself comfortably. External helps you to get along with the society. In this day and age, you have to have that component going on for you. You go in a social group, you look around, you find out, hey, which group is going to take to me and which group is not going to take to me. So in that case, yes, you are depending on external validation. So what do you think about that?
So you said something that not isn't necessarily I wouldn't conflate terms. So it wouldn't be being dependent on validation. You can receive validation, sure, but it doesn't have to affect your self-image and how you see yourself. That's all I'm proposing. Like we obviously have validation, in jobs and in things and all the time, but it doesn't have to affect us. We could say, oh yes, thank you for your comment, and move on. We don't have to, the saying goes, get a big head over it. We don't have to let it affect our ego. We don't have to get overly confident about it, because I think too much of that, especially not to mention when people are to your face and they're having conversations, they're very, very rarely going to give you, harsh criticism, for example. They're only going to, for the most part, for social norms, praise something about you, even if it's very simple, even if it's superficial. You look nice today, this, whatever. They're very rarely going to give you objective criticism that you might need to grow, right? So if we listen to too much external validation, this can lead to a hyper-inflated idea of who we are, right? We can overestimate our abilities. If we have 100 people say, you're very good at doing this, why should I improve it if I'm already very good at it, right? So if it's like, if I feel inherently like I'm not good enough at something and I have 100 people telling me, oh, stop, you're great. If I place too much emphasis on that, that would lead to a distorted self-image, because they don't know all of the little idiosyncrasies with me, because they're only seeing what I choose to portray. And if I depended on that external validation rather than just hear it, let it, accept it, acknowledge it, and thank them for it, and then just move on with my life and not let that really alter my trajectory of my opinion toward myself, that's a lot of different case than being too reliant on it. And I think that's the danger precisely, is it would lead to a distorted sense of who we truly are, because they're only seeing who we present, right? They don't see all of me. Somebody in going out in public, they don't see all of me. They only see what I present to them. So therefore, all of the only thing they could praise is what they see, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? And that's going to be reaffirmed and reaffirmed. I think that the episode is a perfect example of that. She was very externally validated, but only for that little character she was playing. Like when she went home, nobody knew what she was truly like. You know what I mean? And that's why there was a disconnect, a discordance between her opinion of herself and other people's validation of her.
Next question is from Priya. She asks, what is true individualism in a social age?
Very, very good question. Honestly, I would say it's valuing authentic expression over appealing to the mob, I would say. Because, you know, I brought up earlier in Joseph's answer, if I say something controversial online, even if it's what I authentically feel and what I believe to be true, if I weren't expressing that based off of fear of criticism, I mean, there's all types of context. I know we've talked about in the past with like, you might have to, you know, mute yourself a little bit for a job or a relationship or something. But if you're not in that case, and if you wanted to authentically express yourself and voice your opinion and express your colors to the canvas of the world, and if you didn't do that because you valued, you know, this little image that these people view you as, I think that would be completely discordant with individualism. So I would say individualism in the social age could look like authentically expressing yourself in exactly what you feel, not being a mouthpiece and a parrot for other people's ideas. And yeah, not catering to the mob if they criticize your ideas and your opinions, not changing your idea, you know, standing your ground when you believe something to be true, you say it regardless of the consequences, and then deal with those ramifications after.
Last question is from Sarika. Sarika, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I guess it just was like a more of like a personal like example. I guess sometimes like with validation, maybe like women in an emotional sense might want that like emotionally from men, and that matters more to them. And yeah, even from society, I think it's difficult for women to, you know, break the glass ceiling, so to speak, because there's so much historical conditioning about, you know, it's not like women go to work wearing a suit every day. You know, they have to pick from a multitude of outfits, for example. Like there is a facet of being aware of like your personality and fighting to have a voice. But I think the key is like collaboration is the key. And like to someone's point before, like saying, I don't know, I don't care is not like, acceptable. But so individualism and society, but collaboration is really important. It's fine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't remember what particular question I provided the answer to, but I think it was Gene. What I was saying, you have to have some sort of compromise in reality, right? You can't just go do whatever you want, especially in a workplace, because there's obviously other people who might be in control over your income and your livelihood, of course, right? You could get fired, you could get let go, you could get exiled, you could get criticized. It's a lot different depending on the contingencies of your lifestyle and of like your social contracts in the world and your relationships with certain people and certain employers. Obviously, there's all types of context and nuances, but I do agree it is a matter of finding some compromise, finding some common element and common ground to step foot in. But as long as I would say you don't implicitly feel that like guilt and shame that you're betraying yourself, or you're perpetuating a caricature of yourself, a shell of yourself, because I think long term that would lead to a lot of distress, a lot of psychological issues that would manifest themselves in your behavior in a toxic and detrimental way. So I would find a compromise that is manageable for a long period of time. And if it's unmanageable for a long period of time, if you really feel like you're burying part of yourself to fit this image, I would personally say I wouldn't really try to engage in that trajectory of my career or my life. I would always try to find something more ideally suited to whatever area I'd be willing to compromise, if that makes sense.
Excellent. So now we go to breakout rooms. John, could you go ahead and talk about the questions?
Yeah, so we have 3 questions to facilitate further discussion into this topic for the breakout room. The first question is, what do you think some indicators are that we are relying too much on external validation? Like, how can we spot some red flags if we're trying to, place too much emphasis on other people's opinions of us? Second question, how can we place more value on our own private opinion than public opinion? So assuming we go along with the hypothesis that a lot of us place too much emphasis on external validation, how can we dial that spectrum back a little bit? The third question is, does the age of the internet, does the age of information either cause or amplify this need of external validation or sensitivity to criticism, you can also add. So those are 3 questions.
Excellent. So what we're going to do is I'm going to start the breakout rooms. We'll run that for 20 minutes, and then we'll come back here to share our takeaways. All right, folks. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now. All right. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. All right. So it's time for takeaways. So I'm going to call on people in the order in which I see them, and you can talk about your takeaways. You can take up to 2 minutes, summarize what you got from the meetup, any thoughts that you have about validation, internal validation versus external validations. And if you don't want to share your takeaways, you can go ahead and type skip. So I'm going to start with, let's see, Barry, Jean, and Paul Hirsch. Barry.
Well, my big takeaway is the golden rule. Do unto others as you have them do unto you, or love others as you love yourself. And if you don't love yourself, you can't love others, and you can't connect to others. So it's all about taking care of uno numero before you take care of other people. That's the big takeaway I get. And if you don't love yourself and you're afraid of yourself, you're going to be afraid of others, and you're not going to love others. So it isn't an either or thing. There, as everything it is, it's connected, and it's just giving priority to yourself. Nobody else is going to give priority to you. You got to do it.
Excellent.
And that's what I'm going to be talking about on Wednesday, is how you can be a super agent and give priority to yourself.
Absolutely. So Barry's going to be on Wednesday. Don't miss that. I'm really looking forward to it. I've got a sneak preview, and I tell you, shouldn't miss it. Next up is going to be Jean, Paul Hirsch, and Maxine. Jean.
Yeah, we have very vivid discussion group. And I think what I learned is quite interesting. I think we have to build up our own value system. When they have a stable value system, then they were able to judge what is right, what is wrong. Then it's not very easily be affected by other people's opinion. Like Aaron mentioned, a certain party is afraid to show himself, like not to invite to the party. I was thinking, luckily, Shirkan's parties, everybody's invited. You won't be excluded because of your opinion. And I also observe, the younger people, like my kids, they constantly thinking about how to fit in because they don't want to be excluded from the group. I think when younger, maybe your value system hasn't been built. It's kind of imitating and learn. You have to learn how to work with that others. As you get older, you have to find yourself, develop yourself.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Paul Hirsch, Maxine, and MP. Paul.
Okay. I've been thinking a lot about, even before this session, the issue of putting value on other people's opinion of you. And I think in general, my own bias is that that happens naturally as we grow up and try to fit in, especially as teenagers. But just as we outgrow believing in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny, I think we should outgrow being dependent on external validation. And I think it comes from the fact that the first 2 or 3 years of our life, we are literally dependent upon the kindness of those adults around us. It's a matter of life and death. And I think that seeps in, and it erroneously feels like dying when we sense that we are not being approved of. And I think it's an irrational connection to that state of infancy.
Wonderfully put. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Next up is Maxine, MP, and David. Maxine.
I think in order to function in society, you have to have a mix of internal and external validation. It's fine if you are in an epidemic and you're living alone. Well, you can have your internal validation. But when you go out into the world, no one cares about your internal validation. They care about theirs. And in order to get along with them, you have to kind of fake it. You have to pretend to be interested in what they think of you. But don't listen too hard, because you will really get into trouble if you do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great observations. Next up is MP, David, and Wendy. MP.
So I'm still grappling with being reduced to a blue chip stock or a junk bond. That really speaks to my question that I posed to John earlier. And I really liked his insights about using overlap with authenticity, who you really are, and showing up with that to the world. But I think something to really think about is just the movement towards how everything is being commercialized. And it's almost as if every interaction, even outside of the professional arena, is now like a hustle in terms of not just self-worth, but in terms of your worth to others as an investment that goes beyond your competence as a professional or what have you. So I think it's just something to think about out there. And I thank Jonathan and Shrikant for this presentation.
Thank you, MP. Next up is David, Wendy, and Mark. David.
So, John, I thank you for your selection of the topic tonight. And I just watched the program or that episode right before the meetup here, and it brought up a number of thoughts. And I guess from one context is how does your self-worth, your strength or your confidence in yourself allow you to deal with your external feedback, and whether it's criticism or praise? I think that plays a lot onto it. MP just brought up something that struck me, which was, are we moving inadvertently through our social media and our technology to a transaction-based interactions, where we do things primarily focused towards receiving praise and acknowledgement? And I think of the number of people that are on, I guess you could say, have YouTube channels and our Twitter feeds that actually go out and do things and record their videos and post their information for that feedback, whether it's the gratification of the likes or, to the point when they're successful, the financial transactions and the compensation that they can receive. And one thought that comes to mind with the coronavirus was one of those YouTube guys had his mansion in Los Angeles, had a party during the summer with like 150 to 200 people, posted it up on his YouTube channel, and got incredible feedback because the police came and raided the place. But he generated a phenomenal amount of excitement, if you will, and attention to him, because he intentionally did something that, if you want to think about it, was totally irresponsible considering the pandemic and the virus that we had going on. So I wonder if inadvertently this technology that we have, the social media, potentially could move us in a direction that we might really not want our society to move towards, which is manipulated, transaction-based, and self-serving.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Great observations. Next up is Wendy, Mark, and Deborah. Wendy.
Hi. So as Barry said, priority things is yourself. So I think is not make a judgment to yourself. And when you think for my ideal to be the independent, when you think some things, you just do some things, not think other people how to think about you and think what's the result happen to you or some things. So I think it is contractory is between the internal and the external, but the things is how to you keep yourself. And sometimes I learning intentional try to do some things and other people dislike or other people may be angry, but I just try to train myself. I'm not killing other people. So I think this should some training, you how to be yourself, how to be the independent. You need some action, some behavior. So you need some training to fix your mind. You have to consistent and insistent. Another, I think this is about age, because I think if people get older, they will more free to be themselves if they get older. And the younger people, because they are ambitious, they try to grab all the things because they are younger, and they try to attract the outsider, get more social because they are younger. They have a lot of future. That's why they very focus on other people's mind. But I think gradually, if they have more experience, they will more free to be themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Great observations. Next up is Mark, Deborah, and Sarika. Mark.
So a lot of my thoughts have already been expressed, but I would add the following. So you have these opinions in your head, and I think one of the first things you have to do is identify, is it an internal opinion or is it an external opinion? Where does this opinion of self come from? Is it something I learned as a child and never questioned? So that's the first thing. Figure out whether it's internal or external, but then of course, is it actually accurate and is it of value to me? These are all questions you need to ask yourself rather than just to say, oh, this is somebody else's opinion, I'll automatically discard it. I mean, you need to judge everything. But then, of course, the question is what criteria do you use? And we discussed a bit in the group, like you need a foundation in which to assess this. So you need to have a degree of self-awareness and what I would call a core philosophy. Know your core philosophy, know something about who you are, then you can judge these opinions to see whether you should accept or reject them, or maybe take some of it and not all of it. But without that core philosophy and a sense of self-awareness, I think you are at the mercy of opinions that you can't judge the value of.
Fantastic points, Mark. Thank you. Next up is Deborah, Sarika, and Lloyd. Deborah.
Okay, so I have 2 points, I guess. I actually wanted to disagree with Maxine's comment because I don't think you have to lose yourself by engaging with other people. I kind of think it should be the opposite, actually. That true connections would enhance both or maybe all the people involved. And hopefully, I mean, obviously this happens from time to time, but hopefully you're not going in, just humoring people. But also, I guess this is a little bit different, but this is more maybe a philosophical or like psychological kind of question. I'm trying to figure out, like, if you do engage with people who maybe don't have like a lot of internal validation or maybe a high sense of self-worth, is there a way to support or encourage other people kind of without forcing that external validation on them? A way to encourage their own internal validation and reconcile that in a way, because by its very nature, maybe you're trying to help them, but then if they're gauging who they are based on your praise, like, I don't know if how that exactly is helpful. So I don't know if there's a way to do that. Yeah.
Excellent question. Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Next up is Sarika, Lloyd, and Jyoti. Sarika?
So this reminds me a lot of like, I find myself to be very critical of mass media and mainstream media, especially the way that it displays gender, race, and class. The paradigm caters to a certain demographic. And unless you have the ability to, if you don't have the representation of your particular demographic on the TV screen, and then it can be very confusing to people about how to organize their own identity. And especially in America, where we say, oh, culture and diversity, this and that, but then, almost every TV show has the same sort of character, same storyline. We have like token people from other cultures. It's not actually that diverse. And it's difficult, and you have to want to seek out independent perspectives and independent views. And so, I mean, that's one thing where, like, it's presented to us in the Hollywood place. But then with social media, like going back to what people said, and also, with the advent of machine learning algorithms, et cetera, where they will perpetuate products and ideas based on patterns that exist, and they will perpetuate biases. And it's going to become more important as a public discourse, especially in our country, to question and talk about these things, because other countries have an AI strategy. China's AI strategy is build a firewall, our way or the highway. Like India's strategy is probably more democracy laden, but like there's that. Europe has a strategy of implementing GDPR where they put limits on personally identifiable information that can be used. What is America's strategy here? Yeah.
Thank you, Sarika. Next up is Lloyd, Jyoti, and Jean. Lloyd?
Oh, thanks. John, just wanted to thank you for the topic. Our group kind of focused a lot on your accomplishment journal and the idea of the importance of writing down your long-term goals or where you see yourself, to make them a little more concrete rather than having them be very abstract and changing willy-nilly from day to day. And it's more than a to-do list, but I was curious if you could share maybe a little more with the group. That accomplishment journal sounds exhausting. And at the end of the day, do you want to do that? And wanted to know a little more, I mean, without spending a lot of time, but how much do you need to write down, and what should you write down to steer yourself? I imagine like a ship, steer yourself in the direction that you want to go. So what must you be writing down? Do you need to write down goals, or you write down accomplishments? Maybe just to give us a little more idea of, for those who like to write things down, what would be beneficial to write down.
Thank you, Lloyd. Next up is, let me see, I missed one. Jyoti, Jean, and Marvin. Jyoti?
Yeah, okay. Without a doubt, I think internal validation is a preferred thing to have. You can't depend on external validation because it's there or not there. However, every human being from time to time has a need to be validated. And there is nothing wrong in that. If you have your integrity and your personal self-respect intact, then you can seek external validation from time to time just to feel good about yourself. There's nothing wrong in that. That doesn't mean that you are a codependent person. That doesn't mean that you are depending on the validation to make you something. That just says that at times you just need to feel good, and it's okay. It's all right. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Okay,
Excellent.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Jean, Marvin, and Joe. Jean?
I already talked.
Oh, you already talked. I'm sorry. The Zoom keeps moving people around. Sorry about that. Next up is Marvin, Joe, and Faye.
Yes, I'll try to remember my thoughts. But essentially, it relates to last time discussions about authenticity. And I believe that the ultimate power of living an authentic life is the power, or the capacity to forgive yourself, forgive others. It sounds very abstract, but I hope I can explain a little bit. So basically, it's the kind of feedback, criticism, judgment that trigger negative feelings in you that actually derail you from your authentic life, right? But flattery also does the same thing as well. So those things come from all directions around you when you go through our life. When you go to the airport, check out, get on the bus, or the traffic light. So basically, what is the common thread among all these triggers that kind of assaults you throughout the day? Common thread is through all of that is you. You are the center of all these events that are happening around, and they're happening regardless of you, independent of you. So basically, and you have absolutely no control of them. Well, but they have the potential to control you. So that is the thing. But you have complete control over yourself. And what is the control that you have over yourself? Is how would you feel about it? How would you process the trigger emotion that goes within you? And that determines who has the power. Do people have power over you, or do you have power over yourself? And if you let them have the power over you and let the trigger run your life, then you lose your authenticity.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much, Marvin. That was great. Next up is Joe, Faye, and Bharadwaj. Joe?
Yeah, I'll just be brief. I think the idea of having a value system in place is critical. So then you have something to evaluate feedback. So if you start to express yourself and you're getting opinions that are back, you have to determine whether those opinions are valid or important. So it's critical to the feedback loop to have a value system of what you find to be important, because this helps you identify what you're with your authentic self. And I also think that this also has direct relationship with how often we express ourselves and in what forms we express ourselves. And that goes to privacy, as I was speaking about earlier. There has to be a certain degree of privacy. Like if you're always putting yourself out there, well, then the feedback that you're getting is probably going to be all over the place. So I think you have to be very intentional with what information you're putting out there on social media or whatever, in order to not pervert the feedback loop against your value system. And so I think that there are a few different layers to this, your ability to really be able to analyze when you need to be adjusting yourself, when you ought to be living maybe tempering the way you express yourself, and then also know how that feedback actually relates to exactly who you want to be. So.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Faye, Bharadwaj, and Donna. Faye?
Yeah, so I started to think about that age.
that time in my life when I started to care more about other people's opinion of me. And I think that if I were to ask anyone here, I doubt that people will say any time before the age of 13. And I felt like just that period of childhood, we're very self-centered. And children in general, they're very authentic people. And I think that comes from a sense of self-centeredness, right? Children, infants, they don't care if you're sleeping, if you're on an important work or Zoom call. They don't care if they hurt your feelings, or embarrass you in public. But as we grow older, we grow out of that, right? And we develop this sense of empathy and learn to care about other people and their opinions. And we also learn that this quality of being self-centered is a bad thing. But if you look up, one of the definitions of self-centered is independence, to be independent of outside forces or influence. And so maybe we need to learn to be a little more self-centered, obviously not the extreme of a child, but a little more self-centered in order to outgrow this need for external validation and to be more of our authentic self.
Thank you. Thank you, Faye. Great observations. Next up is Bharadwaj, Donna, and Mike. Bharadwaj?
Thanks, Srikant. I'm still processing my thoughts on the discussion here. Two, maybe three threads that I have, I'm trying to wrap my thoughts on. The first one being in this more and more digitized world of social interactions. I'm wondering if are we going down a path of inevitable external validation, a social structure where external validation is more prevalent, like showcased in the show, than it was so maybe a decade ago. Are we essentially snowballing to such a society? And second, more in my own life, I guess I'm trying to differentiate between external validation that might happen at work, criticisms that I might get from my colleagues versus validation from social media platforms. Is that a difference there, and how, and if so, how do I change my mentality to look at them differently? The third one being looking at internal validations. Is one's own biases, is one's own blind spot, could that affect the way internal validation work? If someone's more egoistic, are they going to only look at more of their accomplishments and not look at their failures? And if one is more pessimistic, are they going to look at their failures more so than their success? Is that going to be a more biased view by looking only at internal validation? Those are the thoughts that I'm still processing on, but
thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Bharadwaj. Next up is Donna, Mike, and Laura. Donna?
Because we are social beings by nature, we can fall into the trap of seeking external validation. To counter this, I think it's important to go within. The more we value our true selves, it's easier to value the true self of others. And the key to that, I think, is to be vulnerable. So when one's vulnerable, when I'm vulnerable, then it's easy for others to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is really just a beautiful thing to see and experience with someone else, because it can be scary to reveal yourself as well as to see someone else in that very raw, free, uninhibited state of the true self.
Thank you, Donna. Wonderful observations. Thank you. Next up is Mike, Laura, and Aaron. Mike, I'll give you 1.5 minutes. Are you there? Okay. Next up is Laura, Aaron, and Julie. Laura?
I'm trying to get my, okay.
Did I have my 1.5 minutes already?
Oh no, go ahead, Mike. Go ahead.
Okay, well, okay. We're moving into an algorithmic society that is what I got out of it. We're already there. We don't have to reveal ourselves. Now that computers are getting to be smarter than we are, the singularity they'll be a lot smarter than we are. And the limit case is the IRS will tell you how much money you have. They'll know how much money you have, how much money you need, and how much money you need to send in. And now what that means is when computers get super intelligent, should we begin, the society is going to begin, or the powers that own these computers are going to value these computers more than they value human beings. And would be okay, for an example, for this artificial intelligence or the people controlling the artificial intelligence to exploit humans and even kill them, like we do to chickens and chimpanzees. So that AI and the singularity is one of the things that I've gotten out of this, that there's a lot of things as to what the future of work, the future of money, and the future of society gets into. And that, I think, that dwells on it. Now, I've used 2 minutes and 5 seconds.
Wonderful. Mike, I've found that when I give you half the time, you speak twice as well. So I think that's an excellent pattern that has been established. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Laura.
Okay, I don't know what to say about any of this. I know about how it works. I mean, the validation. I mean, you sort of have leaders and subordinates and in all kinds of combinations, and it usually works as subordinates want to perhaps be like the leaders, and they'll give up everything to be like them and so forth. And then I started thinking about my life, at what point was I a subordinate? Did I do that? And possibly, yeah. And I can think of like points in time where I know where it hooked on to be like exactly like that, because in 10th grade, you could wear villager clothes, which were matching skirts and sweaters, and that was in. And if you did that, you were part of the in crowd. So that was a pretty easy way to fall into it. I don't think anybody cared about value systems and this. And they're very simple-minded people we were. And then 11th grade became a revolution, because we were worried about Vietnam, and we suddenly changed everything around. And suddenly we were hippies and we were this and that, and every social circle. So that changed completely. And so that for 2 years, life was very different. And we thought about different things, and none of those things were important because we were focused on Vietnam and ending the war. And then I went on to, whatever. And so I never think about these things, and now that I'm my ripe old age, and I'm not going to give that away particularly, but I've become very brazen in this period, and I have a voice that I've developed, and I have been independent. I have done what I've wanted to do. I've taken the roads that I've taken for various reasons. I've been successful with them. I've been a changer. I've been an innovator. I've been and that's what I've done. And I've found people to come along. So whatever. So I don't know. That's all I can say. Yeah.
Great observations, Laura. Appreciate it.
Did I fit in 3 minutes though?
Yes.
Good. I'm working on mine too.
Aaron, you're next, followed by Julie. Aaron.
All right. So a wise guy once told me you only have to answer to yourself and the person that sleeps next to you. And I think that's kind of extreme. So I'm going to kind of like maybe push the boundaries a little bit on that. I think when you're evaluating public opinion, you're looking for the people that you respect in this world. I think maybe though that could be like a safer boundary of like people that you actually respect or have something to teach you. And I think a good way of gauging that is, would I disappoint this person? And when you say that, it has to be not just an acquaintance, not your boss, not the people you work with. It has to really be somebody that, one, genuinely has an investment in you, and two, you genuinely respect and have an investment in them. So I think, and there may not be, you may not have anyone in your life that actually meets that criteria, which is okay. I would then just default to only listening to yourself or the person that sleeps next to you if that's not the case. So I think we can make those exceptions. So I think that if we do develop friendships, if we do develop bonds with people, and we really come to trust them, and beyond just forced, contrived work engagement or party engagement and so forth, then that's okay. But again, I think that respect and trust thing just has to be there.
Excellent. Thank you, Aaron. Next up is Julie, Kevin, Julie, Jairo, and Kevin. Julie.
Yeah, this really hits to the core of me because up until I was 15, I was really aligned. I wrote books and plays when other kids were on the playground. I was very inner directed. I had no sense of limitation, nor did I have a sense of superior or inferior, nor did I have a sense of being uncomfortable in my own skin. But when I was 15, that trajectory got like, I collapsed to the point where I couldn't speak for years without stuttering. And it's still really hard for me because so much self-consciousness and fear came in. And it's been very miserable because where I was at 15 was open-minded and curious. Eventually I gave my power away to a bunch of people that really weren't worth it at all. And decided there must be something wrong with me because I didn't understand them and I wasn't being accepted by the bullies in the playground. And my way out, I've suspected that if I get to know myself better, because in the end, people pleasing, you end up not knowing who you are anymore. You don't even know what you think anymore. So I've mentioned my journey away from vagueness into a place of personal truth and conviction that this call is really helping me with. And before that, only writing was helping me. And so for me, I need to know myself. Writing down my wins, coming from a place of strength to address my issues is a powerful thing. If you guys have kids, I don't, but I definitely, if someone had been there to tell me that what people say and do says more about them than it says about me, if somebody had been there to tell me that, I wouldn't have made such a decision that there was something wrong with me that altered my trajectory so badly. What else did I'm letting curiosity guide me, because the point is the fear that's kept me stuck for so long and kept me not honoring myself, taking some risks. And I believe that if you move towards the light, the darkness falls of its own. And if I recommit to my values, fear will be a moot point. And so and I think saying a CC prayer is very powerful as far as getting yourself out of the way and being the answer that you're looking for from other people. So you get into that receptive mode, that centered place that's not so poisoned by fear. And we're in a fear-based world, so it's not easy for anybody. But anyways, thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Next up is Jairo and Kevin. Jairo?
So what is this value system? And is it something like the center of Shrikant's for lightning things, and it's like the principles or something like that? And then is one constructing a value system and remodeling it? And is there possibly a universal value system that will work for all, or or a template for it that we could develop that would work best is like the the golden rule or something? Could that just be something like that? A universal value system that would work for everyone to kind of simplify it, and because it seems like someone was mentioning that an accomplishment journal doing that would be very tiresome. But if we had some kind of system that would just guide us to the right decisions in all occasions, in all meetings, then life would be easier, I think. What do you think?
Thank you. Thank you, Jairo. Next up is Kevin.
Thank you, Frank. I got two different takeaways. One is, yeah, we definitely need one own value judge system. I guess the system you developed with four system help the topic today. And also as general, we need to consider our own personality, culture, value we achieve, and your own gender experience and different stage of life. This maybe a task the goal you set is a long goal, short term goal. This another takeaway. Actually, I reread the question John posed, the last question. Does the modern age of the internet more so cause or amplify the dependence on external validation? I will put a big yes. That's reality is that external validation plays more role than ever. More divided, yourself to your society. It look like we connected more, but actually we divided. It's hard to focus on internal validation. How much room do we have to, ignore the external validation, focus the internal? For example, let's see social media and the history from PC state, email, then we use the pager system, they use iPhone, smartphone, then the internet, then use one phone. We don't need to catch one phone. You can go all the world. Then also from the financial or personally, we can support ourselves by our own work. Used to be, we can either farm or hunting. Now look at, can we do that? And for this retail store, used to be we can convenience store everywhere. Now we used to be it's Walmart. Now even bigger, it's Amazon. One store for all. That's the life for everyone. We cannot control. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Now I'm going to recap what everybody has said very briefly. So Barry talked about the importance of loving yourself as a precondition for loving others. Jean talked about developing your own value system as the focal point. Paul talked about need to outgrow the validation of others. Maxine talked about the need of mixing both, the need for both internal and external validation. MP talked about the commercialization of other people's validation and the need to develop authenticity as a check against that. David talked about how social media is moving us towards being manipulated, transactional creatures focused on other people's validation. Wendy talked about the importance of training yourself, about how to be yourself, and how as younger people are more focused on their peers, and towards the, as you grow older, you realize the importance of developing the inner eye. Mark talked about the importance of examining whether an opinion that you have is your own internal opinion or external, and importance of asking whether it is true and whether it is it's of value to you, and the path of developing core philosophy and self-awareness as a way of establishing solid foundation. Deborah asked about how you can support somebody who does not have a strong sense of internal validation without making them dependent on your external validation. Sarika talked about how the media and the social media affects our validation models of others, validation bias of others creates that. Lloyd talked about the value of the accomplishment journal and development, writing down of long-term goals and how writing can be used as a tool. Jyoti made the point that once you develop a strong foundation in internal validation, then pursuing external validation and enjoying external validation is a good thing as long as you have a solid rock of internal validation. Marvin talked about the critical importance of forgiveness, both forgiveness of yourself and of others. Joe talked about the fact that value system, developing your own value system, is critical because that's what establishes the various feedback loops. Faye pointed to the authenticity of children and what we can learn from that. Bharadwaj talked about how social media is driving us towards social validation, and talked about and had a very interesting question about if you're focused on internal validation, how do you make sure that you are not overtaken by all kinds of biases that you yourself have? Donna talked about the fact that we are naturally social and that the path forward is to learn to value your true self and thereby learn to value the true self in others, and being vulnerable as a path towards doing that. Mike talked about our movement towards algorithmic society and all the implications of that. Laura pointed out that during her younger years, she was influenced by various fads, as most young people are, and that as she's getting older, she's become more brazen in pursuing her own values through her internal validation. Aaron pointed out that it is worth pursuing validation only from people whom you respect. Julie talked about the importance of authenticity that she had as a kid, and that it is important to realize that people's reaction to you is more about them than about you. Jairo talked about the possibility of constructing a universal value system, and Kevin talked about about how internet is driving us towards external validation. So this was, it's just amazing range of observations and topics. So just incredible. So let's see. If anybody has kind of a overall points about, the big points that I got from it is that it looks like the internal validation, and different people expressed it in different ways. Barry talked about loving yourself. Jean talked about developing your own value system. So it's like, it looks like kind of developing that internal validation system is a prerequisite. And then once you have that, it allows you to interact with others, to actually benefit from kind of social validation, but selective social validation. So there is a concept that Ray Dalio has called the believability score. So you should get validation from other people, but you have to evaluate whether it is worth getting validation from people, the point that Aaron was making. So I think, many people pointed to the fact that you have to develop this internal code. So Barry talked about loving yourself. Jean talked about developing your own value system. Maxine talked about having the internal and the external. MP talked about the authenticity. Wendy talked about training how to be yourself. Mark talked about everything about self-awareness and developing core philosophy. You see the common pattern. It's about developing the core. Let me see. Then you have Jyoti talked about developing the foundation of internal validation. Joe talked about the value system. Marvin talked about the capacity to forgive yourself as a way of establishing, yourself. Then Faye talked about authenticity of children. Then let's see, Laura talked about being brazen. Aaron talked about being selective, about you deciding who you accept, whom you regard validation from. So I think kind of developing of a core of internal validation, and then it looks like it is valuable to get external validation, but in a selective way, because we are social beings, something like that. So that's what I got from all the discussion. So internal validation first, internal value system first, and then some kind of external validation on a selective basis. So anybody who has comments, just keep them extremely brief. Okay, extremely brief comment, just 1 or 2 sentences. What do you think about the relationship? Internal first and external, or the other way around, or any comments on this? So it's going to be Julie, Marvin, and Jairo. Julie, what do you think about internal first and then external?
Well, I think that if you're around, I think it's really important to people that whoever said that about respect the people that if you're going to give your power away, give it away to people that you respect.
Excellent.
And the fact that the people were saying to me, you think too much all the time. I wasn't in the right pond.
Thank you.
And so it's very important to be around encouraging people.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up. So this is a lightning round.
They will help.
This is a lightning round. So just couple of 2 or 3 sentences, so we can get as many thoughts on this as possible. Okay. So it's going to be Marvin, Jairo, Kevin, and Laura. Marvin.
Okay, I'll try to speak fast if I am able. So essentially, I go for no validation at all. So the idea is about emotional intelligence. It's about on the emotional level. And so basically, the gist is, like Shakespeare said, nothing is good or bad. Thinking about it, make it so.
Okay.
So that is emotional intelligence. That's the key word.
Thank you. Next up is Jairo. Jairo, what are your 2, 3 sentences?
Yes, perhaps internal first sounds good, but actually developmentally sounds like we get external first from our parents. So, but I guess as we get older, we start to developing more internal. And then another thing that came up is Aaron selectively getting validation from the people you value, I guess. And it sounds to me that could be critical because you might be going to the groups that you prefer, and then it would cause a separation of society.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Laura, Joe, and Jean. Kevin.
Yeah, I would say it's we kind of choose personally. We choose external validation as gradient for our own needs. But however, external is like a chicken egg problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, what are your 2 sentences? Laura, you need to unmute yourself. Okay, next up is Joe, Jean, and Lloyd.
I'll be really brief. I think that it's critical that your value system be a coherent value system, because if it isn't, then everything else will lead to bad decisions or cognitive dissonance.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Laura.
I'm back. Okay, internal, external, but I also think that sometimes you need that dissonance at the external level so that you help to move yourself onward, because you could get stuck in one place and just think, that your value system is the end all be all.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Jean and Lloyd. Jean.
Yeah, I think when we build our internal value system, instead of, if we don't have the environment, look at the classic book. I think student is a key mentioned. Read the book who after 1,000 years still exist. They will provide something more stable value system instead of reading news or look at mass media. That's the source we can get more solid value system.
Excellent. Thank you, Jean. Next up is Lloyd.
Yeah, I would just say today's discussion was great. If you needed a New Year's resolution, develop more of an internal validation system and try to diminish the external. And I would just say it takes time to develop. I mean, it's not a light switch.
Okay.
I think it's like a muscle that you kind of have to develop to, make this shift.
Excellent. Thank you, Lloyd. So now let me flip the question. Starting with the internal validation, I think most of us are agreed that you need the internal validation, and you get that through developing your own self-awareness, value system, the confidence in yourself, forgiving yourself, being gentle to yourself, all of that. Now, we are social beings. We've talked about all kinds of things where external validation can go wrong. At the same time, many people have made the point of where it is useful to have the external validation as a feedback. So the question is, I want to now try to make the sharp distinction between when is external validation good and when is it bad. Okay, so that's the question on the table. In as brief a way as possible, say when is it that external validation is good or seeking of external validation is good, and when is it bad? Okay, so I'm going to start with Donna and Mark. Donna.
So from a design perspective, I look at it as the internal first, kind of you come up with your prototype, and then you go to the external, and then you work iteratively back and forth between the internal and external.
Wonderful. Excellent. Thank you, Donna. Next up is Mark, Kevin, Aaron, and Jean. Mark.
I guess I would start with consider the source. So if you trust your opinion because you have expertise in the area, that's one thing. If you lack expertise and you are in contact with others that do have that expertise, then you might value their opinion and their input. But that doesn't mean you accept input from everybody. So always consider the source.
Excellent. Next up is Kevin, Aaron, and Jean. Kevin.
Is the external validation added to the value and your principle, so take it. Otherwise, evaluate from opposite point of view. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Aaron and Jean. Aaron.
When they have something you want, if you want to be rich, talk to a rich guy. You want to be fit, talk to a guy who's really fit. It's that simple. Just if they have something you want, then that's the feedback you want to be getting.
Excellent. Excellent point. Next up is Jean.
I think if you want to sell something to other people, you have to get their validation. So you have to see what they want, then you can sell them.
Wonderful.